If you've been following our Bane Wars series, you'll know that we've got some upcoming battles going on in our 10mm fantasy campaign. So, today on Dragon's Teeth, we're looking at making some 10mm terrain. Now, at least one of the potential battles we've got coming up is going to take place around a village. Normally where we've got one force occupying the village and another force comes along and decides to take it over, because villages in a campaign are primarily used as supply bases, so obviously very important. Now, any village out in the middle of the Bane is going to have some protection around it, so the first job is to make a palisade. And I'm using the same material I used to base my 10mm figures, which are vinyl floor tiles, very cheap to buy from B&M or similar places, and they are very sticky on one side, which helps with the construction. Basically, I'm making some strips. I thought I could make one huge side at a time, but I'm going to break it up into smaller sections, because then that gives me a chance to make this a little bit modular. I can adjust the size of the village as is required. And of course, halfway through I remembered a village has to have a gateway in it. So again, I've used the strip of figures there just to give me a size for the gate, because I want to be able to get a unit of figures in the gate. I did end up putting the gate in another position, as you'll see later on. So that's the base layout done. I'm just rounding off the corners as well, because I figured I'd want to curve the corners in, not make them too square. Now, all of this build today is going to look a bit rough, partly because I'm doing this sort of on the cheap, I guess, and I'm rushing through it fairly quick. But I don't mind that for two reasons. One, it fits in with the aesthetic of the setting. You know, the Bane is a very rough and ready area, so there's not much in the way of fine architecture. And the other reason is, of course, anything that's on the tabletop needs to be functional. It's largely representational, because if we had even a 10mm scale village on a 6x4 table, it's probably going to take up a third of the table. So any terrain, especially your buildings, is primarily representational. For my basing, I'm going back to my air dry clay, which I've used for a few projects now. Still have quite a few of these pots left. I have to say, this was a very good buy. This is lasting a long time, this stuff, and it does the job perfectly for terrain. Biggest struggle is getting the lid off. So then I simply peel the backing paper off the tile, that's the sticky side upwards, and just apply the clay, just to build up something that I can put my palisades into. And of course, an earth bank would form part of the defences of most palisades as well. On to the actual palisades next, and I think the easiest thing to use in this scale are cocktail sticks. There, I've got my base ready. I'm working while that clay is still wet, obviously. Then it's just a matter of deciding how tall to make my palisade, and I worked out I could get at least 2 or 3 palisades out of each cocktail stick. Now, one thing you quickly learn is if you place your cocktail sticks down flat and you cut through them with a craft knife, the ends tend to fly off into the distance. So what I eventually worked out was I sort of hold one end of the cocktail sticks between 2 fingers and the other end between my little finger and thumb, and I used a pair of craft scissors to cut through them. This way I had both ends of the cocktail sticks secure and was able to keep them from disappearing into the carpet. And of course I'm doing this while the clay base is still wet. I mean, it does take a fair amount to dry, so there's no huge rush. And it's simply a case of then getting a few of the sticks together and pushing them into the clay base. So the next thing to think about were some houses for this village. I do have some houses already, some cardboard ones that are okay, they don't look that great. I wanted something a little more substantial. So I've got some foam core block, and it just so happened that this was exactly the right height for 10mm sort of cottages, I guess you could call them. I used one of my old cardboard models just to get the cottage size. I also have some MDF buildings as well. These are flat roofed houses, as you can see. They're a little bit longer, so I also use one of those as a template, perhaps to make more like a sort of longhouse type structure. The strips are then cut into blocks, and obviously I need to tidy these up a little bit. It's a little bit difficult cutting this. I probably need a wire cutter rather than the knife, but I use the knife just to tidy the ends off to make those smooth. Now again, these are rough cottages or stone crofts, so they're not going to win any architectural prizes, but they do the job. The next thing then was to create the roof, and I did that simply by going from the middle of the top side and cutting a diagonal. And again, I didn't need to be too clean with this, because in order to create the thatching, I'm using my clay again. The plan was to put a light covering of clay over that edge and then stipple it with a cocktail stick to give the impression of thatch. Before we get to that stage, however, the next thing I did was to use a normal ballpoint pen and just create my stonework. So two things here. One, of course, you can press into the foam so you get an indent, and because it's a black ink pen, then that stands out nicely even when it's painted over with grey. There's our stonework done. Now it's time for the thatching. So as I said, we're back to the clay, just a thin layer on the top this time. And we just smooth it down a bit with a damp finger. And then using the cocktail stick just to create that stippling to give us that effect of the thatch roof. I did start with the brown clay for this project, but finished that, so I had to switch to yellow halfway through some of those roofs, but that doesn't really matter. In fact, you know, that's a closer colour to an actual thatch roof than the brown. Another feature of any village is fields, because wherever people live, they have to grow their food, especially in fantasy or medieval type societies. And it's one thing that does annoy me in fantasy films. Even Lord of the Rings, you know, they ride up to Minas Tirith and there's this huge city fortress, and there's not a single field in sight in front of it. I'm not sure what the people inside eat. Now, the thing with fields on any table is you want them there to give a bit of cover, to break up the terrain a little bit, make it look a bit more interesting, but you have to be able to put figures on them. So I'm not going to put a lot of vegetation on these fields. It's mainly going to be paint. I'm going to put some hedges in because they can give useful cover and, you know, make things a little bit more 3D. So once I've cut out some shapes from my floor tiles, I'm using this matting. It's a fairly sort of rubbery type of texture, and if you squint and close your eyes and paint it up and look from a distance, it gives the impression of maybe a ploughed field or certainly a bit of rough ground. And the great thing with this is because I've got that sticky side on the tile, I can just stick this stuff straight on and then trim it to size. Once that's done, I spread some PVA glue over and I start sticking on some vegetation just your usual sponge foliage. I've also got some scatter to put on it, again just as a bit of texture. And for hedges, I've got these green, I suppose they're pipe cleaners they were originally. I got a huge bag of these for a couple of quid, I think on eBay or Amazon, so very cheap. Now they do take a bit of sticking down because they're wire inside, but I found the PVA can do the job, but if anything does come a bit loose around the edge, then a dab or two of super glue will keep it all firmly in place. And there's our fields ready to be painted. And of course the good thing is I was able to do this while the clay was drying, because you know that takes a good few hours to set, so that gives me plenty of time to get a start on the houses and the fields, and everything now is ready for painting. And there's a few stages to the painting. First of all, everything gets a dark brown undercoat. This is one of my cheap acrylic paints from the local craft shop, and as you can see there, that's the Palisades undercoated and all put out. One thing I did do, by the way, is on the underside of the bases I put a letter ABC, A through to H I think, just so I remembered what order to put these in, because of course I didn't make it at all regular. I put that gateway in as well, so the gate is removable, and as I say, it's representational. An actual village will probably have a larger footprint, but it's going to work on the tabletop. Once everything is painted in brown or grey, the second step was to use a wash, one of my home-brewed washes, and just to put a generous wash over everything. Same goes for the fields as well, particularly on those hedges, because those pipe cleaners, they're quite a vivid green and they do stand out a little bit, so I wanted to dull those down. I gave them a quick once over with my lovely green Innsmouth wash as well. That dulls anything down. And following that, we add a highlighting coat of a lighter brown, just to give the piece a bit of depth, a bit of tonal variation. Same goes for the cottages. I use an even lighter shade of brown, I think it's a sand, and a dry brush for the roofs, just to really bring out that thatch effect. I also painted up those MDF buildings because I've made those but hadn't painted them, so they got the dark brown base coat and then the lighter brown dry brush on top. I was hoping to make some more tree bases as well. I bought 3 bags of trees a little while ago, and I've put them somewhere in the shed and I've forgotten. They're probably taken root by now. So once I eventually find those bags, then I will be making some more woods and forests as well. And here's the finished village put into a little layout with my pre-existing roads and trees and my 10mm figures. There's a mixture of vampires in there, some humans, and a couple of elf units. I think some gargoyles in the village as well. So yeah, pleased with that. For a quick and cheap job, I've got something that looks the part on the table and is playable, and will give a nice focal point as and when we have one of our battle for the village scenarios in the Bane Wars campaign. Thanks very much for watching today then. I hope you found some useful tips in there. As I say, fairly crude looking, those cottages, but that fits in with the setting anyway. And as always, I'd be happy to hear any hints or tips that you have for constructing 10mm villages or buildings of any size. I know there are some good 3D printed and resin ones out there, but I think if you want to make a whole village with perhaps 20 buildings, you know, that's a bit of a hit on the wallet for something that might not get a lot of use. This then, with a bit of foam and some cocktail sticks and other bits and pieces, is a nice quick and easy way to decorate your table. As always, if you haven't already, please do hit those like, share and subscribe buttons. And if you want to find out the latest developments in the Bane Wars campaign, just check out the Bane Wars playlist. We've had our first conflict in Phase 2 now, with 2 attacks actually, on fortresses, and a certain amount of skullduggery going on around the gates especially, so do check that out. Okay, that's it for today folks. I'll see you next time.